Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you all had a nice lunch break. We will start the afternoon with our spotlight presentations, and there's a small change to the program. We will have 9 instead of 8 short papers. That's because Sylvia van Zyl, who unfortunately couldn't join us due to health issues, couldn't join us, and that's why her supervisor, Anne Herbst, will present her project on her behalf. So she will present both her own and Sylvia's project at the end. So we have 9 presentations in total. The rules are simple. Each presenter has 3 minutes to present their work, followed by 1 or 2 questions, depending on how we go in time. And we start right away. And the first presenter is Matthias Bräunig, and he will talk to us about ambience, exploring the physiological effects of drones as auditory Ganzfeld.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm going to present a paper that a poster that you find in the left corner of this room, and I have a little bit a side access to the topic of our workshop. That's because I come from a medical environment. I work at the Clinic for Psychosomatic Medicine and Psychotherapy in Freiburg at the University Medical Center. And what we usually do is we do experiments with experienced meditators. We do experiments with mindfulness and attention regulation. And we do this with EEG measurements in most of the experiments that we do. And the problem that we were facing was that we couldn't define a good baseline. I show you this first slide. The problem is that in the research on mindfulness that we define as mental glue, gluing together moments of attention, we want a good baseline that is a reference to the measurements that we do with different subjects. And because the baseline usually in EEG is just an open spontaneous measurement, lots of things are going on. Of course we have mental wandering, we have mental imagery, and we thought it would be a good idea to contrast this condition with a sound stimulus that doesn't itself impress sonic objects on the subject. That means we needed a very stationary stimulation, and we tried out pink noise, for example. We tried out ambient sounds, and finally we turned to the Indian instrument of the tampura, which is a monochord instrument and which is used for accompaniment in Indian music, as you well know. And it turned out that this might be a very good stimulation, because it's a very invigorating and lively background, and we don't impose any rhythm or melody on the subject. So we came to that idea of using a drone as a contrasting condition, because we had experience with Ganzfeld. Ganzfeld is a German word, but we use it in English as well. And we could roughly translate it as complete field. It means a sensory isolation, deprivation, in which usually the eyes and ears mainly are deprived of objects. And what happens is that the mind very quickly develops inner images and thought trains. And what people usually experience after only a few minutes is that they hear voices or they see scenes of their life, and it's like a little bit like hallucinations. And so the question is, can we use a drone accompaniment just covering the ear sense, that such images appear or do not appear, and for some experienced meditators they will immediately recognize it as a kind of mental event coming up and then enhance their awareness, or for the less experienced, they will hook up on it and follow after. So we wanted to see if there's a difference between the two. And the ambience is created by, we call it dronescape. So the tempura, but there are many other choices. You know, the ambient music, in minimal music we have instruments, especially in medieval music, that use sympathetic strings, burn music, and of course the drone accompaniment. And what you see here is a time-resolved spectrum of the tempura drone. You see the plugging of the 4 strings very quickly coming down from the high frequencies to the ground frequency. But what you also see are these ripples here, yeah? And they are created by the special attachment of the strings, which have a grazing touch with the bridge. And that makes the sound so very lively. And you can look it up on the poster. We think it's something really special, and so the whole study turned from a purely physiological, exploratory physiological study to a musicological study, where I worked together with an Indian colleague who told me that we should go deeper into the musicological side of that question and see what it does to the physiology. The big question is, why is this instrument so ubiquitous in Indian classical music? Why is it so you cannot have the music without it? And it must have some physiological and psychoacoustic effect. And that is very interesting, and my own take on it is that the Indian music has empirically found out that taking the listener from source listening to the more timbral experience, timbral listening, creates an easy access to inner experience and images. And that we think is a very valuable insight and should be researched more. We did this as a pilot study. It's more or less in the beginning stage, but we want to pursue it further. And if you want, we can discuss it later at the poster. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. We have time for one question. Are there any questions? If not, yeah, Maiko. Just a second.
Sorry. Do you?
I have it on my computer, but not here in the slide. So I mean, you know the tempura from the raga music. It's in the background usually of singing when you have a composition played. Yeah, then you always have the very high and harmonics background. It's like a waterfall repetitively in the background. And what it creates is we compare it to a loom. Yeah. So where you have warp and weft threads, and the drone creates a tension in the listener, and the main instrument actually takes out that energy from the listener and creates an aesthetic experience. That's what we think.
Okay, thank you very much. And next up is Helena Dukic from the University of Graz, and she will talk about music about static archetypes in the imagery of guided imagery and music clients. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Okay. Basically, I did a study regarding guided imagery in music. And what we looked at is basically, about the background because Jorge talked about it. Music therapy, in particular GIM, is basically clients experience imagery evoked by music. So that made us think that music might be related to narrative in some way. So how to research this? We basically had to define what a narrative is and what are the elements of a narrative. And so we called those narrative archetypes, such as setting, protagonist, and characters in a narrative. And there were something that was found in all narratives and all narrative forms. And you can see that those things were also categorized by Jung, and he sort of categorized them into two different principles: eros, which is passive principle, and a nurturing principle, and logos, which is kind of active principle. And so these two principles permeate all human activity, everything that we perceive and everything that surrounds us. And so the aim of this study was to investigate the extent to which pieces in GIM's nurturing program, because we also did the nurturing program, funnily enough, had a similar psychological function as narrative forms or any kinds of stories or fairy tales or anything like that. And our question was, is the music group displaying more narrative archetypes with eros characteristics compared to the control group? Because we assumed that that would be the case, as the nurturing program was designed to kind of have these feelings of nurturing and mothering. So we thought that probably we will see more eros principled archetypes. So how did we do this? Well, we had 23 participants. Each of them went through the standard GIM session individually. And the music played was the music from the nurturing program, which is about half an hour or a bit more long and has 7 different compositions. And the procedure was they all went through the standard GIM session, and the sessions were recorded and the imagery was transcribed, so that we ended up with transcripts that were then later divided into 33 paragraphs. Roughly, that was about 3 sentences in each paragraph, and there was sliced minute by minute of music. And so the imagery was analyzed in a way that we divided the 3 narrative archetypes that I talked about into 7 subcategories. So those were flora, fauna, feelings, actions, structures, events, and characters. And the imagery was sorted into these categories using coding. So we had 5 independent coders, which were undergrad psychology students. And their task was to identify the main object of the protagonist's attention in the imagery, and then categorize this theme to the 7 subcategories that I mentioned. And so that was done with the transcript from the GIM sessions. And then as a control group, we used 23 different fairy tales from different cultures, different countries, that were also transcribed and divided into 33 paragraphs. And so the coding procedure was done with those so that we could identify what kinds of imagery happened in those fairy tales. So what we found out is that the subcategories of flora, fauna, feelings, and structures were selected significantly more often in music group compared to the control group. And the categories of events, characters, and actions were selected significantly less often in the music group compared to the control group. So what does that mean? Basically, nurturing program can invoke feelings of childhood and mothering. As you saw, that there were some categories that belong to eros that basically were evocative of these nurturing feelings. But we also noticed the dominance of static archetypes in music group that are incapable of conveying a plot. So, for example, we didn't see much action or many characters in the music group, and those are the archetypes that kind of drive the action and develop the relationships between different characters in the story, and they were not that common in the music group. So in conclusion, the dominant categories of structures of flora, fauna, and feelings are so-called plot static, so they don't convey a plot. We could conclude from that psychological function of creating an emotional or scenic background is characteristic for music, and driving a narrative plot or development between these archetypes or separate characters is not. So yes, that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any questions? If not, I have a quick technical question. What were the criteria for choosing the narratives of the fairy tales? Were there any specific criteria to match them?
Yes, so we found this basically online. There's archive of different fairy tales and different folk tales and so on. So we tried to have from all over the world. We tried to have as diverse fairy tales as possible, and we basically made a random selection. So in order not to be kind of particular or not to be, you know, to choose them by liking. Mm-hmm. So basically that was like sort of a lottery that we did, and then whichever fairy tale came up, if it was not from a country that we already had, or if we didn't have, for example, if we had 2 or 3, I don't know, German fairy tales, then we wouldn't pick any more of those. So it was very important for us to have kind of a diverse network of stories to choose from.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And up next is Cecilia Durojai, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, sorry, from the University of Cape Town. And her presentation is called Visual Mental Imagery in Expression and Evocation of Emotion, the case of Dandan music of the Yoruba.
Thank you. Basically, I'm not a visual, my study is not basically on visual imagery, but this topic is taken from my PhD thesis that is ongoing, and the thesis is on emotional responses and the performance practices of Dundu music of the Yoruba. So to introduce the Dundu, Dundu is commonly known as talking drum and is associated with the Yoruba ethnic group of Nigeria. It can be described as the kind of music played on those instruments, or, okay, thank you, either as a kind of instrument played on those drums, or as a double-sided membrane drum. That is what the Dundu is. And it is used to send text messages over a relatively short distance, coded text messages. So one can say Dundu is a literary instrument as well as a musical instrument. And for this particular study, or the general study actually is conducted in 2 major contexts, in cultural context and out of cultural context, because Dundu is majorly associated with festivals and ceremonies and all. So basically what I wanted to do with the major study is to see how Dundu musicians will perform outside of their natural context, which is their festival context and all. So to do this, then generally I used semi-structured interviews, observation, and experiments that was thought of in the field, but using the method of the recognition, production recognition in emotion studies. So for the experiment, 4 groups of Dundu musicians from different locations within the southwest Nigeria participated in the study, and they were asked to reproduce 5 emotions that will be perceived of those emotions, and that could possibly also induce emotions in their listeners. And the emotions are sadness, happiness, fear, anger, and one other one that was gathered or collected from the interview prior to the experiment, and it's called Oriwiwo, literally meaning head swelling. Now, the thing about Oriwiwo is that right now I don't have an English word, equivalent of Oriwiwo, because it's related to all of the other emotions and also different from them. And it's characterized by high arousal, and it can be of negative or positive valence depending on the context of where the music is happening. So that's when they use the Oriwiwo. So, so they were asked to perform the music, and after the music, the performers were asked that what thoughts came to their mind from the point of hearing the instructions up to the point of performing the music, that what did they think about. And so I gathered different responses from them, and they were analyzed using thick description and a grounded theory approach, which is development of codes and categories. So the coding methods use open coding, process coding, in vivo coding. I don't know if I have to explain that. Then, after the gathering information from them after the interview, following the performance. So it was discovered that the musicians make use of socio-cultural cues, and in terms of praise poetry, there's something they call oriki, praise poetry. They use proverbs, they use something they call alujo, that's basically used for the performance of happiness. Alujo will mean dance, literally, dance rhythm, something like that. And then, of course, psychoacoustic properties to communicate the emotions to their listeners. And in reproducing the emotions, they conjure up imageries that are actually associated to a context. Remember, the experiment was conducted outside of their natural context. There's no context there, but they were still thinking of certain context, maybe a burial context or something warfare or battle, depending on whatever they are using the music for naturally. So for those are the examples of the imageries, and it also was discovered that the imagery that's coding the images, it was discovered that they are personal to the musicians, and they are also communal at the same time, in the sense that, say for instance, someone is thinking about a burial context. In the Yoruba culture, a burial will bring about naturally happiness, especially a burial of an old person. But so the person experiencing the emotion now, the person feels sad for missing the father or something, so there's maybe nostalgia or something coming up, but generally the person is happy to see people around him or her at that point of the at the context of the burial. Yeah, and also maybe in fair, for instance, naturally this warfare, or let me take under this Egungun or Shango festival. It's naturally a festival, but it's a legend that has to do with somebody very fiery and ferocious warriors and all that. So there's some quotes in the poster there. So someone can just think of maybe this Shango or something, this legend or this personality coming up or something, but still being happy because of the environment or the context. So yeah, and so it was then concluded, oh sorry, my conclusion is not here. It was then concluded that personal and communal experiences form the basis of visual imagery involved in the expression and evocation of emotion in Dundu music. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Thomas, I'll give you.
Thank you, thank you. At the abstract, you also hint at the listeners. You had listeners to sort of do some kind of decoding experiment of this. Can you maybe explain that in a few words?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so for the study, I just didn't report it because I just focused on the performance for this one. Yes, we had listeners listening to the music after the performance of the emotions. So, and then they were also interviewed afterwards. I mean, I used questionnaire first. So I kind of did a closed-ended response format and open-ended. So they, first of all, were taking maybe yes or no, did you experience this or that? And then after that, they were asked to also explain or to give a narrative, something like that for whatever they feel. And yeah, it was discovered that they also use, just like the performance, they also use imagery as well. And in fact, most of their responses correlates with, or is actually similar to what the performers also have. And then it was then concluded that perhaps having the same result is influenced by the culture they both share. I mean, like the usefulness of the music in the culture and everything. So probably that's the reason why they're having yeah, same result or similar. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And our next speaker is Gerardo Gozzi, and he will talk about illusory spatial perception in a piece for solo instruments. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm a composer from the Royal Academy of Music in London, and the core focus of my research is how can we use mental imagery in music in the process of making music. And for mental imagery in this case, I mean the three-dimensional perception of how do we project the sound that we hear, the sound sources, in our mental projection of the space around us. A bit complicated, but perhaps that can clarify what I mean. The outcome of my research, of course, is music. So unfortunately there's not enough time here for this short presentation to actually play some of the music, but if you have a good pair of headphones and you're curious, you can find in my poster down there QR codes and links to recordings of a couple of examples. The examples that I can present and discuss with you later if you want are a piece for solo instrument for acting horn player, where the horn player actually filters the sound that he produces in his sound source in different ways, by singing, closing the mouth while singing, singing inside the instrument, singing and playing the instrument, and the horn can be stopped or half stopped, open. So all this action of filtering of the sound source combined with a very resonant acoustic in the space allows the listener to imagine, to project the sound source as with a dimension, with a size. So thinking it as a small point in at a precise distance on the stage, or as pervading the whole space around them. And also another piece that I could discuss about is a piece for violin solo, where I use a great deal also of of mind wandering in this piece, because one of the core moments, the core aspects of the piece is building up expectation of resonance. So I tried to mock a sort of viola d'amore in a violin. So viola d'amore is an instrument, a big viola with resounding strings that start sounding by sympathy. And in doing so, I create an artificial presence of a resonance that can happen simultaneously to the action that causes it, or delayed, and eventually this long delay triggers mind wandering. So the imagination, hopefully, of a possible delay or a memory of what the piece has been, or other things, just distraction. I think, yeah, that's about it.
Thank you.
Measured it to be very short. Thank you.
It's probably a bit hard now to discuss without having heard actually the music, but are there any questions anyway? Yeah, Rolf Inge.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Are you using no technologies, digital sound modifying technologies? Is everything unplugged? Is that correct?
So yes, there is a small use of technology in the sense that the violin piece, for instance, is for violin and tape, but the tape is simply the same violinist pre-recorded. So there's no use of artificial sound, if we want,
okay,
in my work. So the idea is, how can we convey the sense of three-dimensionality in sound using traditional instruments, or in an acoustic way?
Well, good, because then I would say it's a very brave project, given the available technology of spatialization nowadays, where you can really split up and sculpt the sound. It will be very exciting to see an unplugged version of spatial composition.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the links on my poster, just at the very end of the room, on the center, is the tiniest one. You'll have codes and links to videos of the pieces, so that can give probably a better idea. Of course, the live experience of such pieces is so important, because any recording just flattens all the experience. But at least you can have probably a vague idea of how the resonance of the room works. Okay.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our next speaker is Aisha Hamilton from University of Leiden, and her title is "Does Auditory Imagery Ability Predict Cue Dependence in Music-Supported Motor Learning?" Please.
Hi. So I'm kind of going to be focusing on a very specific aspect of what Rebecca spoke about this morning. And as she said, imagery can be applied to other functions to help support various things. So within the research that we did, we went from the perspective that music is being used increasingly to help retrain disordered movement in clinical settings, for example, with stroke patients, people who have Huntington's and Parkinson's disease. And it's still unknown what exactly underlies successful treatment outcomes in these settings. Successful treatment outcomes is quantified as healthy, normalized, well, not entirely healthy, but more normalized movement after music, which has been previously used as a cue, is taken away. And it's also of interest and not exactly known the influence of how varying components of music can essentially influence and maximize these treatment outcomes. So within this, we hypothesized that auditory imagery ability would predict cue dependence. Therefore, we would see that once you took the music away, people who had a high level of auditory imagery ability would show less dependence on the cue and reproduce more accurate sequences of movement. We also looked at melodic content, and we assumed that music that was melodically supportive of the movement being learned would lead to less cue dependence than music that did not contain a supportive melody. And finally, we also looked at learning conditions and how this can affect the outcome of learning. We actually started with what we're calling a spontaneous learning condition, where we didn't give participants an exact instruction that the cue would be removed. After we did the study, we realized that they didn't quite perform in the way we wanted, so we did another study where we gave an explicit instruction that told them the cue would be removed, and we compared the two groups to see how this affected the outcome. The methods are quite complex, so I will keep them very brief here, and if you want to know more, feel free to come by my poster, and I'm happy to explain them or answer questions. We used 53 healthy non-musicians, and they participated in either the spontaneous or the explicit learning condition. They had to learn a movement sequence. It was a finger tapping study. So there were 6 training videos where they had the opportunity to learn this sequence, and then we tested at the end how dependent they were on the music. So it was a cue dependence trial. We took away the music and see how well they could reproduce the movement without the music. We also gave them some questionnaires, so we measured auditory imagery ability through the vividness subscale of the VMIQ, and we also controlled for musical ability by using the Goldsmith Musical Sophistication Index. So we found the question was, does auditory imagery ability predict cue dependence in motor-supported music learning? In this case, we found it didn't, but we did find that contrary to what we hypothesized as well, we actually found that the non-supportive cues fostered less cue dependence than the supportive cues. And we did, though, confirm our third hypothesis, which was about the learning conditions. And we found that those who participated in the explicit learning showed less cue dependence than those in the spontaneous learning condition. And interestingly as well, we also found an interaction between the content of the cue and the learning condition. So those who were in the spontaneous learning condition actually showed a more marked difference in their performance than depending on the type of cue they received in comparison to the explicit learning condition. So in conclusion of this, whilst we didn't find that auditory imagery ability was predictive of cue dependence here, we did see the effect that learning condition and cue content can have on motor learning in a music-supported environment. Obviously, this has clinical applications, and it means that it should be applied where relevant in treatment settings. However, we can also apply this to other contexts and look at how learning conditions, for example, in cue content, can influence and change skill acquisition in general.
Thank you. Are there any questions? If not, I have a quick... no. Georgina.
Thank you. You said that you've measured you used VMIQ and Gold MSI. Did you also use a questionnaire to measure auditory imagery abilities, like
Sorry, I got my questionnaires confused.
Yeah,
so we, because the project looked at other measures as well. I actually used the Bucknell Auditory Imagery Scale,
Okay.
the vividness subscale of the bass, rather than the VMIQ, but I got them switched in my head.
But you use the VMIQ as well to...
Not within this specific
Okay.
research, but within the general umbrella of research.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go into detail.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. And next up is Sarah Hashim from Goldsmiths, University of London, and the title of her spotlight presentation is Investigating the Effects of Suppressing Music-Elicited Visual Imagery on Emotional Arousal.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, so that's the title of my research, and one of the aims of the study is to address the numerous previous experiments that have highlighted the various factors that mediate between music listening and an emotional response, so visual imagery being one of them. So the way that we have considered in approaching this relationship is by trying to suppress visual imagery. And so that way we are able to ascertain if experiencing a visual image is important for feeling an emotion in response to music listening, then suppressing the visual imagery during music listening should then lead to inhibited emotional arousal. So in deciding the best method for visual imagery suppression, we look to clinical studies, several which that have found that visual spatial tasks are actually the most effective, such as Tetris, the most effective method for intrusive visual imagery suppression in patients such as PTSD, as opposed to verbal tasks, for example, which were instead found to either have no effect or actually like increase visual imagery, intrusive visual imagery. So the musical stimuli that we'll be using are short excerpts of orchestral film music, and we'll be conducting a pilot study to first determine if visual imagery can still be experienced as such short excerpts of music that are lasting between about 30 seconds to 1 minute long. And these results will be drawn from those who score highly on the musical visual imagery scale. And so that would indicate that they have a high susceptibility to visual imagery. The visual spatial tasks that a few clinical studies seem to use are eye movement tasks, which where the participant just has to look at a shape on a screen and then follow it. And this will act as the distractor that should either interrupt or inhibit visual imagery completely. During the main experiment that we will be conducting, the participants will be split into two groups, where one will listen to the excerpts with and then without the distractor, and then the other group will do the opposite. And then after each trial, they'll be asked to rate their visual imagery and emotional arousal levels, and at the very end rate their general visual imagery and musical visual imagery. And what we hope to find from the analysis afterwards is that those experiencing high visual imagery will then have reduced emotional arousal in response to the distractor, whereas those who don't really rely on visual imagery to feel an emotion towards music should largely be unaffected. And this should hopefully lead to the possibility of visual imagery suppression being used in a more musical context, and more strongly support the hypothesis that visual imagery can mediate between music listening and an emotional response. So I'm sorry I don't have any results to show you today, but that's being developed right now. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Do we have any questions? Well, I have a question. You said one of the ways of suppressing visual imagery is playing Tetris. Yeah. Obviously, there are many other cognitive and motor processes going on if you play Tetris. So this might introduce more confounding variables. Are you going to test this as well, or are you only focus on the eye movement, or how do you balance this?
No, we won't be using Tetris. But, we won't be using Tetris as the distractor tasks. It'll just be the eye movement one, so we won't really have to worry about the motor element of playing Tetris. Mm-hmm. And the eye movement task is very passive for the participant. I think they'll just be having to stare at a screen and then follow the shape along the screen. So I don't think that should arise as a variable that we'll have to account for.
Okay.
So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
And our next speaker is Andrea Hepworth from the University of Kent, and the title of her presentation is Music Evoked Autobiographical Memories and the Relationship to Nostalgic Effect, a pilot study.
Do I have, if I just click on this, can I enlarge it?
Yeah.
How do I enlarge? Just sort of go like that?
Sorry, you can't.
Oh, sorry.
It's just this.
I can't make it bigger then.
No.
Okay, no worries. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andrea Hepworth. I'm from the University of Kent, and my MA dissertation last year was entitled Music Evoked Autobiographical Memories, or MEMES, and the relationship to nostalgia. I'm sure you all know what memes are, but basically memes are personal narratives and memories from an individual's past that are recalled and often re-experienced when listening to music. The level of detail can vary from a general recollection of a period in an individual's life, for instance, school or university, to a very detailed account of a specific event or episodic memory in that individual's life, which is often accompanied by sensorial detail and visual mental imagery. Nostalgia has also been shown to be an emotion that has well-being benefits. So as part of this, my dissertation, I decided to conduct 6 semi-structured interviews with friends and family about their experience of memes for 2 reasons. Firstly, to see if their experiences matched my own very nostalgic experiences, and secondly, to see if their accounts would support the literature that I'd been reading. So the results showed that confirmed both that yes, their experiences were very similar to mine, and that what I was reading in the literature, I was finding I was able to match extracts from the qualitative evidence to stuff I've been reading in the literature. I was hoping to kind of zoom in on this and show you some examples, but I don't think I can do that, so you'll have to go and read it on my poster back there. So just briefly, many of the memes were shown to be positively valenced, very nostalgic accounts, and if you read some of the extracts on my poster down there, you'll see that the emotions and feelings that are being described clearly mimic the affective signature of nostalgia. Additionally, the data also validated other aspects of nostalgia that I'd been reading about, specifically the tendency for people to look back on past events through rose-coloured spectacles and to perceive the event retrospectively as being in a more favourable light than it would have actually been. And the desire to want to go back to that time and place because it is perceived as better than the present, or it's perceived in a more favourable light than it actually would have been. So basically, there are more examples down there, but in conclusion, as I say, the data did support the literature. The accounts were seen to be very nostalgia evoking. Accounts were often of significant periods in milestone periods in people's lives, for instance, marriage, school, university, birth of children, etc. And accounts also featured significant others, such as friends, family, lost loved ones, current and former partners. In the more wider context of my dissertation, in conclusion, I did find that memes are self-defining in that they aid identification of the self through association with the past. And nostalgia itself has been shown to bring benefits in terms of offering psychological support and aid in social contentedness. So therefore, there is some parallel between the psychological and social benefits of memes and nostalgia. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this presentation. Are there any questions? Yeah, Anthony.
I'm a bit deaf, so I don't speak
up. Sorry. Did you have time in the study to look at memes longitudinally and to sort of go back later and ask similar kinds of questions about similar music, what music triggers, and see whether things changed? I'm just wondering, because right at the end you you sort of stated about how nostalgia can have links to well-being and sort of ground the self and all of that.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether that's a sort of one-off process per memory, as it were, or whether you can actually develop through life with this sort of the process you're looking at.
That's not something I looked at, no. I guess, yes, it would be. I mean, one thing I did find that apparently most memories that are recalled from a period in an individual's life known as the reminiscence bump, which is between approximately circa age 5 to circa age 20, but it kind of fluctuates a bit depending on which report you read. Is that what you mean? Sort of, yeah. So, but I didn't specifically look at that. No.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And our last presenter is Professor Andre Herbst, and she's presenting her own work on glimpses of evoked responses when listening to music, traveling through time and space, and then also Syria's work as a second presentation.
I just need to ask you to move on. What do I press? Okay. Good. Good afternoon. I would like you to imagine that my colleague Timos Papatsikis is standing next to me. I will be reporting on a large-scale project that we have been working on for the past 5 years. In our project, we are trying to combine EEG findings with behavioral findings, especially when people are listening to music. We would like to see what kind of responses are evoked. We are trying to find if there's a comparison between the EEG findings and the behavioral findings. And we have worked with a certain protocol to try and compare these two. So far, we have recorded 47 subjects. We aim to record another 20 to have statistical power. The entire protocol is 5 hours long, so to have recorded 47 subjects is quite an achievement so far. What I will be presenting today is it's work in progress, it's preliminary findings, and I would like us to start by looking just at the frontispiece by Tisaru. Aristotle is looking with his telescope, while the telescope is pointing to the sun, but he knows that if you look into the sun you would become blind, so he asked Poiesis, metaphor to look on his behalf. And you can see from the quote that metaphor is basically a model or a picture of something to which we can never have direct access. So the golden thread that runs literally on my poster that has a lot of gold on it through this presentation is episodic memory and metaphoric thinking. I was looking at work by Lakoff and Spitzer, and I was tempted to include Lakoff's Woman, Fire and Dangerous Things, a quote there, just for the heck of it, because the title is quite humorous, but I have not done so. What you see there is zooming into the behavioral part. We have 2 music stimuli, 2 violin compositions, one by a South African composer, Hendrik Hofmeyer, Luamarava. It has a programmic background. And the second piece is by a Greek composer, Nikos Kalkotas. They are both solo violin pieces. A reason why did we choose them? For unfamiliarity, we wanted to rule that out. Both these pieces are in an atonal context. I don't know if you can see well on the slide, but what we did in the, or I handle the behavioral part, what I did there is a participant or subject heard each of these pieces 3 times. So the protocol in itself was 45 minutes long, and the pieces, we swapped them around to try and confuse subjects, and between the pieces we put 3 minutes of white noise, as a way to try and clear the palette. For the first listening, they had to make a drawing while they were listening, white noise. Second piece came, another drawing, and then the second task was to write a narrative, or words, or whatever came to mind. And then in the third task, we used the Hefner list that was adapted by Schubert in 2003. And it's through the Hefner list that we are trying to make the connection between the behavioral and the EEG part. I can explain more about that later on. Now, I have chosen for this presentation results from 3 subjects. Of 2 of the subjects, I've chosen the drawings of both pieces, and 1 I chose just of 1 piece. The reason for choosing them is because they gave varied responses, and I think what we have found so far, through eyeballing, is that there are definitely different archetypes, but I will be able to say more about that later. Now, the drawing that we are looking at now, I wish I could take the numbers away, because it takes away from the artistic value of the drawing, was made by a violist, and she used only gold. And during the interview, when we started decoding, because I don't know what the drawing means, her artwork is an exact representation of the musical structure of the work. And we determined the markers, with the places where to put the markers in, by using 3 musicologists to analyze the structure of the music, so that we have agreement on where to put the markers in. You can see on the right hand of the slide are some of the excerpts. In this piece there are 15 tags. I'm only representing 7 here. And I would like to play you a little bit of the music, so you can just hear. This is by the Hofmeier. Now, in number 1, because she's a violist, during the interview she used a lot of gestures to explain. So the beginning was for her just starting the piece, and then where those little triangles go, there's a squiggle at number 2. That is where she heard the overtones. And during the interview, I have the score there, and we could literally bar by bar relate what she drew. That is an example of how I'm analyzing the work. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the dots right there, it's referring to a certain part of the piece. I think it's the second lowest one. And you will see that there are 5 dots every single time. And in her comments, she wrote 5. So I asked her about the 5, and she said because it's 5, and we looked at the score, and the way that the music was grouped was in irregular rhythms because of the accent. So it was 1 2 3 1 2 or 1 2 1 2 3, which Hofmeyr says is a reference to some African influence. Whether that is the case is to be debated. You will see on the poster, the other drawing that she made is of a pyramid, and that also has structural bearing. The third drawing that I want to draw your attention to pictures a village setting, and the person said, well, I don't really listen to this kind of music a lot, but I fell for this one. The second piece, that is the one I fell for. Now, this is what came out of the interview. I am from a rural area. The music made me reminisce about it. Peaceful music. This is a happy piece. It would have to be a South African composer. Now, this is the music that we just listened to, and the drawing is of a rural setting. And the narrative is, it is a warm afternoon in a village outside Mthatha. A wife is working outside her hut whilst she's filling water from the outside tap. And then during the interview, he interrupted himself, and he said, you know, we do not have inside sanitation. And then the narrative continues. She can see her husband from afar. As he gets closer, she gets excited. And then he interrupted. The music creates that excitement. Story continues. The Xhosa woman takes a basket from her head, and then he said, I can hear the water from the tap, whoop, whoop, whoop. And that is on the drawing. Again, he interrupts the narrative during the interview. And there he was referring to a pizzicato section in the piece. It is a happy family. The husband is coming back from looking after sheep together with their 2 sons who are excited to be around sheep. And he said that the music creates a kind of playfulness. And he also said, you know, it's hard work to look after thousands of sheep for the whole day. So the reason why I chose that one is that even though this subject was not, well, none of them knew the music, but this is not a style of music that he would listen to, he conjured up a very homely scene and something that made him very happy. In the previous drawing, I asked the subject about her use of color, and this is for the other piece, and I just want to quickly touch on that. I choose colors, for example, the purple, it's not in here, because it's richer. I thought the entire drawing would be green. She started with green. Sometimes, when the musical elements, contrasted, I would choose a different color. I choose a softer pink because of the soft ending. I got worried because time ran out. I don't want to leave something undone. And during the interview, it became clear that she wanted to create an artistic whole. She didn't want to leave the artwork unfinished, which I found quite interesting. And then during the interview, she would intersperse the conversation with philosophical questions such as, I hope I was honest. I hope I did not do dishonest things. I found the behavioral process strange as I judged myself. Why am I doing this? Is what I am drawing what I am actually thinking? So there was a sense of self-doubt. The preliminary findings suggest that continuous responses oh, the bullets shifted, sorry. Measured via inserted tag points throughout the two stimuli rendered uniform intersubjective individual emotional reactions. Throughout the 5 cohorts that we collected data from, we found that there was a tendency towards one of the pieces to be experienced as more positive as the other one. However, within the piece itself, where we inserted the tag points, there was a fluctuation of emotions, and the drawings and the narratives and the adjectives underscore the general feeling of the music stimuli. The way that I did it, I laid out 3 pages and I asked him, do you see any correlation, yes or no? So I tried not to lead them. And it does seem as if the musical structure lead to emotional responses, evoked responses. We did not tell the subjects that we were looking for measuring emotion. We just said, we want to know what you are thinking while you are listening to this music. And you can see what we are hypothesizing in the end, and I've already referred to that at the beginning, that we are looking for a correlation between a biological imprint and a behavioral imprint. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I think we moved the discussion to the poster, but I would like to give you the chance to very briefly introduce the project by Sylvia, and
yes.
The slides are just up next, so maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, if you could summarize it, would be great.
Yes, Sylvia couldn't be here. As you know, she is at the moment not very well. There's a picture of her in the right. She collected data from 2 visually impaired piano students and 2 sighted piano students. And what you see here is mapping the journey. They had to listen to a rendition of a Schumann piece twice. And in an interview told her what they heard. So it was based on memory. They did not have the score. And you can see, if you traced just the red subject, you can see how the journey went. It's interesting that one person described the mind traveling in terms of dynamics. Yes, let's move on to the next slide. Because Sylvia is visually impaired, she couldn't do in vivo coding using software, so she used a DAW. And that is her manual coding. And I have pictures where she is lying, looking up at the door. And these, you will see the emergent themes, the visually impaired subjects and the sighted subjects. I think what is quite interesting there is the use of tactile imagery in the visually impaired subjects. What is also standing out is, I need my glasses. What is the inner hearing of music is much higher in the visually impaired subjects, as one might probably expect. In her coding, she also used vocal coding to listen to inflections of the participants, especially for the impaired subjects, visually impaired subjects. There was high frequency in the use of visual imagery, illusions, words and gestures by sighted students. It's interesting that the visually impaired students wanted to have more oral training. A high occurrence of the use of tactile description and imagery by visually impaired participants. Occurrence of descriptions and reference to inner hearing of music by the visually impaired participants. well, some noted the ternary structure. There was no difference between the sighted and the visually impaired students. And they most commonly addressed aspects such as pedaling, dynamics, and articulation. And it's in the graph before, there was a high reluctance at the beginning to take part in this kind of experiment because they are not used to it. But at the end, they found it quite useful and indicated that they have a better understanding of the piece after they have gone through the experiment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And we now continue with the poster presentation, so I invite you all to come and join our presenters and discuss in more depth and with more time the findings and their projects, but not before grabbing a cup of coffee and some cookies, which is outside. And we will continue with the group work at 4 p.m.